They only wanted to see what was hidden under the water. Two teenage cousins in Florida, a veteran guide in France leading school kids, one of Hungary's most careful, celebrated cave divers. Different continents, different caves, the same mistake, believing that experience, youth, or caution would be enough to keep them safe when rock, water, and darkness turned against them. What happened to them in those tunnels is the kind of thing you don't forget once you've heard it. If you're sensitive to real-life tragedy, you may want to stop here. On the morning of April 14, 1990, Troy Spring in northern Florida looked like something from a postcard. Clear, green-blue water pouring out of the limestone at nearly 100 million gallons a day. For most people, it was a place to swim. For teenage cousins Clarence and Richard, it was a challenge. Friends and family told them not to do it. Troy Springs Cave Run sits about 70 feet down, and the water exploding from the aquifer turns that tunnel into a horizontal fire hose. Even world-class cave divers avoided it. Most of the system was still unmapped. The boys went anyway. Wearing basic gear and a single tank each, they dropped into the spring around 9:15 a.m. At the entrance to the underwater tunnel, one of them pulled out a spool of fishing line, their improvised guideline. They tied it off, took a breath, and kicked hard into the current. For the first 50 or so feet, it worked. Then one regulator began to free flow. In normal conditions, a regulator only releases air when you inhale. In that roaring current, something shifted. The valve jammed open and the tank began dumping air constantly. A violent blast straight into the diver's mouth and a storm of bubbles blasting around his head. It was like trying to breathe from a hose you couldn't turn off. Panic hit. Visibility vanished in the cloud of bubbles. The current shoved them backwards toward the entrance, dragging their fragile fishing line with it. They had only one working regulator between them. There was no alternate second stage, no octopus, so the cousins began passing the only good regulator back and forth while the water shoved them toward the run's mouth. As they were tumbled back, their cheap guideline wrapped around their legs, their gear, and eventually their necks. Instead of leading them home, it became a net. By the time another diver entered Troy Spring less than an hour later, the cousins were still about halfway inside the tunnel, so tangled in their own line it took recovery divers 10 minutes of cutting just to free the bodies. There was still air left in one tank. What they ran out of was time, training, and a line that could actually save them. 32 years later, on May 5th, 2022, it was rock and rain that turned a safe cave into a trap. In France, Sabine had spent more than 3 decades guiding people through the outdoors. Hiking, skiing, canyoning, caving. She knew the Sassenage Caves in the foothills of the Alps like other people know their own neighborhood streets. That day, she and 4 other instructors were leading a class of 5th graders through the show cave. Tight walls, low ceilings, but a route designed to be safe. Spring rain had been falling outside, but nothing unusual for the region. Underground, no one hears the storm. Around midday, water from the Furon River began pouring into the tunnels far faster than anyone expected. Passages that had been merely damp a few minutes before started to fill, then roar. The first 2 groups of children were quickly shepherded out through the main passage. Sabine stayed with the last group. As they tried to retreat, the flood surged. In the chaos, one child slipped and was grabbed by the rising current. Without thinking, Sabine lunged, got a hand on the girl, and hauled her back to higher ground. The girl lived because of that reflex. Sabine was now standing in the full force of a growing underground river. Within seconds, she was swept off her feet. One of her colleagues saw her struggle against the torrent and then disappear into the dark water. There was no chance to throw a rope or form a chain. The others got the students to a safer pocket and waited, shivering, until rescuers broke through later that night. By then, Sabine's body had already been located in a lower passage. Every child she'd been guiding made it out alive. The guide with 3 decades of experience, the one person who should have been safest in that cave, did not. If experience isn't enough to guarantee survival, caution should help. In Hungary, even that wasn't. At 42, Martin Marcy was one of his country's best cave divers. Multiple national titles in underwater navigation, world medals, and a reputation for always saying no before he said yes. His friends joked that where they saw adventure, Marcy saw a reason to go home and plan. In early April 2022, he was part of a team exploring the far end of Kossuth Cave in Buck National Park. Past 3 water-filled siphons, they had pushed the known map into a deep passage called Siphon 3, down to about 48 meters. On April 3rd, Marcy went in with the team. Hours later, everyone else came out. He didn't. When the call reached the Hungarian Cave Rescue Service, its leader, Andris, understood what that meant. Even if Marcy had found a tiny air pocket, his window for survival was closing fast. Teams of the country's best divers assembled at the entrance. Kossuth Cave is cold, tight, and unforgiving. Days of effort revealed that part of Siphon 3 had collapsed, a wall of clay and rock where clear water had once been. Helmet cam footage showed a submerged tangle of debris and, in one corner, what looked like the edge of a tank. On a subsequent dive, Marcy's longtime friend Victor squeezed through a narrow gap in the collapse, following the buried guideline as far as he dared. About 30 meters beyond the blockage, in the narrowest part of the tunnel, he found Marcy, still in full gear, pinned where the passage constricted. From the position of his body and the intact state of his equipment, it looked like Marcy had finished securing a new guideline anchor and was on his way out when the roof came down. Perhaps he died instantly. Perhaps he was trapped for a while, watching his pressure gauge tick toward zero with nowhere to go. What the investigation did conclude was this: Marcy hadn't made a mistake. The dive was within his abilities. His gear was sound. He followed the rules he preached. He was just in the wrong seam of rock at the wrong moment. Over the following week, rescue divers turned recovery divers. They bagged his body, unhooked his equipment, and in stages moved him back through the freezing sumps and tight air pockets of Kossuth Cave. When they finally brought him out on April 10th, the rescuers lined up in formation at the entrance while sirens wailed for a minute in his honor. 3 very different caves, 3 very different people. A pair of eager cousins, a selfless guide, a legendary professional. All of them walked into the dark believing they could manage the risk. The water, the rock, and the current disagreed.